conservative historian. The year is 1944, and the president, Franklin Roosevelt, has two very big decisions to make. The first decision is, does he run for a fourth term? And the second decision is, who joins him on the ticket? Before we get to that, let's go backwards to 1940. In that year, Roosevelt also had a very big decision. And that decision was, does he run for an unprecedented third term as President of the United States? Now, this is something that had never been done before. Washington, Jefferson, not even Jackson, ran for a third term, though all of them, more than likely, could have won. Roosevelt makes that decision. He will run for a third term, only he will not do it with his vice president at that time, John Nance Garner. Instead, Roosevelt will replace Garner on the ticket with Henry Wallace. Wallace was a staunch supporter of the New Deal program, having served for 7 years as agricultural secretary in the Roosevelt administration, and was a noted progressive. Roosevelt wanted that kind of progressive support going into his third term. Garner's out, Wallace is in. Now, in the intervening years, after 1940 to 1944, obviously a lot happened. In 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, pulling the United States into World War II and changing the complexion completely of what Roosevelt's role was as president. It was no longer about the Depression. It was now about winning the war. By 1944, there's some good signs coming. The campaign in North Africa had been successful. There were successes against the Japanese in the Pacific. So there were positives in 1944 that Roosevelt could point to. But in March of 1944, Roosevelt receives some very bad news. He undergoes a thorough examination at Bethesda and learns that he is a very sick man. Now, this information about his health is kept from the public, it's kept from the Democratic leadership, it's even kept from some of his military advisors. But it was actually plain to see. And some of those people around him commented on his deteriorating health. Nevertheless, in 1944, Roosevelt makes the decision to run for that fourth term. But, and this is very important, Wallace is going to be dropped, to the surprise of Wallace. Now, there were explanations for this. Wallace, the progressive, was seen with suspicion by some of the more conservative elements of the Democratic Party. Wallace also, personally, was not an extremely popular man. Not the charisma of Roosevelt, but then again, who really did. Wallace is dropped, and the consensus pick, a backbencher senator from Missouri, named Harry S. Truman, is chosen. Plus, a lot of the way Truman conducted himself during the war years lent an aura of integrity. So Wallace is out, and Truman is in on the ticket. But Roosevelt knew, and these Democratic Party bosses who pushed out Wallace and brought in Truman suspected that this was not an ordinary vice presidential choice. A lot of vice presidents are chosen to balance out the ticket, maybe a certain geography or a different ideology, to attract as many supporters as possible to the candidates. This choice was very different. This choice was going to be who the next president of the United States was going to be. And when those Democratic Party bosses, and perhaps even Roosevelt himself, contemplated a President Wallace, it was just simply not going to happen. As it turns out, Roosevelt won the election, takes the oath of office on January 20th, and within 3 months, on April 12th, 1945, Roosevelt passes away. And Truman, as people had suspected, becomes the new president. Now, why is this important? Why this history lesson in 1944? Because in the presidential election of 2020, one of the major parties, the Democratic Party, has selected an individual who will not finish out a 4-year term as president. Now, it does not give us any satisfaction to cite Joe Biden's physical and mental failings, but they are obvious to see. If you look at tape of Joe Biden, even just 8 years ago, in the second election of Barack Obama, you see a man of vigor, a man of strength, a man who can put many sentences together and deliver a barn burner of a speech. That is not the Joe Biden of 2020. Again, it's not something to be reveled in. The fate of infirmity, both physically and mentally, is something that we all must deal with at some point in our lives. The difference is, not all of us are running for president. Joe Biden is. This is why his choice of vice president, or the choice of the new Democratic Party bosses, is so absolutely crucial. If a vote for Joe Biden is not necessarily a vote for a Joe Biden presidency, it's a vote for whomever is his vice president, because that will be the administration that finishes out the term. Now, the Democrats understand Biden's failings, but he is today's 2020's consensus choice and the best opportunity the Democrats have of beating Donald Trump. And that, to use the phrase, trumps everything. Again, the Democrats know this. Does Joe Biden know this? As Roosevelt knew how sick he was, it is problematic to decide. This is the third time that Joe Biden has run for president, and the polls, as of May of 2020, show he has a good chance of victory. He is not going to give this up. It's a lifelong dream. But as voters within the 2020 election, it is crucial to understand that you are not voting for Joe Biden, that you are in fact voting for his vice presidential candidate. And that is just the hard truth. Thank you.